Hi, welcome to my channel and thank you to my subscribers. If you have not already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. In this video, we are going to see how to integrate a Spring Boot web application with AWS Cognito as the identity provider using the OpenID Connect protocol and authorization code Grandflow. Before getting into the configuration steps and then building the Spring Boot web app, I will explain this diagram which actually shows the end-to-end authentication flow that happens in the browser. So when a user tries to access a web application, which is built using the Spring Boot framework, what happens is if you look at the step 2, the web app will actually redirect to the AWS Cognito hosted UI. So it is actually a browser redirect, and here you can see that browser. I just used a Chrome icon, but it can be any browser. And once the user gets redirected to the Cognito hosted UI, then it will display the login page. And in step 4, once the user enters the credentials and Cognito validates the credentials, and if the credentials are valid, then Cognito will again redirect back to the client application, which is basically the Spring Boot web app, with an authorization code in the URL parameter. And the Spring Boot web app will then grab that authorization code and make a backend token API call to Cognito using that authorization code, client ID, and client secret to get access tokens, ID tokens, and refresh tokens. And once it gets all these tokens, Spring Boot web app will validate the tokens and then display the home page for the user in the browser. So the good thing with Spring Boot is that many of these things are already built into the framework, that is like redirecting to the identity provider, calling the token APIs in the backend, getting the access tokens, ID tokens, refresh tokens, validating the tokens. All these things are already built into the Spring Boot framework. So you don't have to basically write any code to perform some of these steps. But you can always customize many of these steps, and it is available in the Spring Boot documentation, which you can always go and refer and customize many of these steps. But this is the end-to-end flow where the user tries to access the application, and then Spring Boot redirects to Cognito, which in turn shows the login page, and the user enters the credentials, and then the authorization code is posted back to the Spring Boot web app in the URL parameter, and then it gets the tokens. So now let's get into the configuration steps. And as usual, I'm using the Chrome browser for making all the configurations, and I will be using the Mozilla browser for doing the end-to-end testing. And I'm going to use the Spring Tools Suite version 4 for building this Spring Boot web app application. So let's start with the very first step of creating a Cognito user pool. So I will quickly go through these steps. I'm going to use most of the default configurations, and I'm not going to get into each and every configuration steps because I'm just going to use the default configuration as much as possible. So let's select username here, go to the next page, leave it as default. We don't need MFA for this integration, at least for now, but you can always experiment later. Disable these options, go to next page. We don't need a self registration, and let's disable these things, and let's leave these things for now and go to next page. Select this one just to get to the next page. Anyway, I'm not going to use this option. Now let's give a user pool name. I'm going to call it as Cognito Spring Boot UP, which is a user pool, and select Cognito hosted UI. The reason is we are using the OpenID Connect protocol to integrate this Spring Boot web app with Cognito, and the OpenID Connect protocol is supported in Cognito user pool only through this Cognito hosted UI. So you can see the note here which says once you enable this, you can have all the features that are uh, applicable for a OpenID Connect protocol. So enable this option and let's use a Cognito domain. This can be any random string. Let me try Cognito ESB1. Oh, I think I should not use that word Cognito. So maybe I will try Cog SB1. Yeah, it's available. And we need to create a public client. Actually, this is this this is kind of a confidential client. We will get into the differences between public and confidential client. So basically, if you look at this note here, it says single page apps, mobile apps. Those are all public clients. Whereas in this case, what we are building is a confidential client which has a server side, uh, which has a server basically, which is built using Spring Boot framework. So let's go with confidential client and call it as ESB client, which is basically a Spring Boot client. And let's come to this URL at a later point of time. But as of now, I will type it as localhost colon 8080. But I think we need to change it at a later point of time, which I will show at a later point of time. And go to the app client settings. We don't have to change anything. We are going to use authorization code grant flow. And let's use OpenID profile and email. So change this to OpenID profile email and remove the phone scope. And go to next page. You can review all the settings and create the user pool. So now we have the user pool, the Cognito Spring Boot UP, and you can check all the configurations in each of these tabs, but the main values that we need are available in this app integration tab, which is the domain name, and then the confidential client that we created, which is SP client. And we will be using all these values at a later point of time. So now let's get to the next step of building the Spring Boot app. So in order to build the Spring Boot app, I am going to use couple of resources. And one is the Spring Security documentation, which is the official Spring Security documentation. Then there is a Spring Boot OAuth 2 project. It's kind of a blog which is available. Like if you go and search in Google Spring Boot OAuth 2, you will get that page, which is a Spring Boot and OAuth 2 blog, which explains how to build a Spring Boot application and integrate it using OpenID Connect protocol. But there are certain things in this blog which is a bit outdated. So that is the reason why I'm going to refer the Spring Boot or Spring Security documentation. So again, you can get this from Google. Somewhere here. Yeah, this is the one. OAuth to Spring Boot security, and if you select OAuth to login core configuration, you will get to this page, the same page which I am showing you. So now let's actually start creating the Spring Boot web application. And so I'm going to use the Spring Tools suite because it has built-in support for Spring Boot framework. So I'm going to create a new Spring Starter project and name it as Cognito SB demo. Go to the next page, and here you search for web and select the Spring Web and go to next page and click finish. And I assume you already know how to use Spring Tool Suite. I'm not going to go through those steps. So I assume you already know how to use a Spring Tool Suite or similar IDEs like Eclipse or IntelliJ. You can use any IDE, whichever you are comfortable with. I'm using Spring Tool Suite because it has very good support for the Spring framework, and I'm sure even IntelliJ has equal support, and even Eclipse should have Spring Boot framework related plugins which you can install, and you can get similar kind of features in Eclipse. So I'm not going to get into like how to install an IDE or how to use the IDE, because you can use any IDE that you are comfortable with. I got some issue here. I don't know what happened. Let me try refreshing it. Or let me just try building this project, clean and build. I'm not sure what is happening. So let me actually delete and start from first. So I will create a starter project, Cognito ESB demo, and let's use Maven instead of Gradle. I don't know if Gradle is creating any issues. So let's go to the next page and select Spring Web, next, and finish. Let's see what happens now. So again, you can use Gradle or Maven or any IDE for that matter. So I'm just trying a different option because it was creating some issues. So looks like now it is fine. So I created a starter project. It is compiling fine. I have the Cognito demo application.java here, and then I have all the static templates, all these folders under the resources. So we have the entire Spring Boot folder structure here. So now let's go back to this blog and go through some of these steps. So this blog explains how to integrate with GitHub as an identity provider, but I'm going to use Cognito instead of that. That is the only difference. And as I said, there are some steps which are outdated, and we will be using the official documentation to get the latest steps. But some of these steps are still valid. So that's why I'm referring back and forth between this blog and the official documentation. So the very first step is to add a home page. So copy this index.html. Let's create a index.html under static folder. Go here and create a file called index.html and just copy this and paste it here. So we created the index.html, and the next step is it says we need to add some of these dependencies in the maven pom.xml. So copy this and go to pom.xml, and under the dependencies add both these new dependencies and format it again just for easy readability and save it. And the next step is it says we need to actually make the application secure, so we need to add the Spring Boot starter OAuth 2 client. Just make sure it's not already there. Starter web is there, but there's no OAuth client, so copy that and add that dependency. So now we have added all the dependencies. We created an index.html. Now let's go to the next step of actually adding the Cognito identity provider details in the application.yaml file. So if you go to this default project that got created from Spring Tool Suite, it uses application.properties instead of YAML. That is not an issue. By default, it creates properties, but you can always rename it as application.yaml. So you can use properties also. It's not anything wrong or something. The only difference is YAML files are easy to read, at least for me. So I go with the YAML format. So here, whatever you see in this blog is the GitHub related details. But in our case, we are going to use Cognito. So now let's switch back to the official documentation. And if you look at the core configuration documentation for OAuth 2 login security, and if you scroll down here, it talks about how to configure a custom provider. So here it uses some Okta related details. So copy this and come here and paste it. Now let's go ahead and modify some details. So let's change Okta to Cognito, and again Okta to Cognito. It gives some error. I don't know what. Oh, okay. It's because of the space. So now I need to update the client ID, client secret, and some of these details. So let's see how to do that. So if you look at the again go back to this documentation. I'm sorry to keep switching between the documentation, but the point is like some of these details are outdated, and that is the reason why I am switching between the blog and the official documentation. So now we need to configure a client application in Cognito for this Spring Boot web application. And if you remember, when we created the user pool, we already created a client called SB client. And I mentioned that we will be updating the redirect URL that we configured here. So if you go to this documentation, it says the default redirect URI template for a Spring Boot security framework is the base URL, which is basically the localhost colon 8080, followed by login slash OAuth 2 slash code slash registration ID. And the registration ID in this blog is basically GitHub, but in our case, it is Cognito. So go back to this URL, and we already have the base URL, which is http colon slash slash localhost colon 880. Append the remaining values and Cognito and save the changes. Now come back to this application.yaml and replace this client ID and client secret with whatever we see here in the Cognito app client configuration. Show client secret, copy it and paste it here. And now we need to update all these URLs specific to Cognito. So if you look at this documentation again, here you can see the documentation for all those values. And if you go to the bottom of the table, it says you can actually configure these URLs by just specifying the issuer URI property. And that is what I'm going to do now. So what I'm going to do is basically use this issuer URI property to configure all these URLs. So just come here and let's find the issuer URI for Cognito. So go to Cognito user pool documentation and go to this documentation. And if you scroll down, there is a API reference and there's a user pool endpoints reference and hosted UI endpoints. And here, if you see, you should find, okay, maybe it's in the federation endpoints reference. Yeah, here you should see the OpenID configuration URL for your Cognito user pool. So copy this, paste it here, and we need to replace the region value and the user pool ID value. So go to your user pool configuration and copy the user pool ID and replace this, and the region is US East 1. Now when you enter, you will see this type of a JSON response which has all these values. So whatever you are seeing here, the authorization URI, the token URI, the user info URI, all these values are present here. You can check it here. Authorization endpoint, uh, uh, JWK as URI, and then the token endpoint. So all these values are here. But the easiest way to configure all these values is just to provide the issuer URI, and Spring Boot will automatically read all these values from this OpenID configuration URL. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to copy this issuer and paste it here and remove all these sticks. So I'm getting some error. Oh, that is because I pressed a tab. So in YAML file, you should be very careful. It should be a space and not a tab. And that's why you saw that warning or error from this IDE. So save this value. Now go back to the blog. So instead of GitHub, we used Cognito here, and we can see all the values here, the client ID, client secret. So now let's boot up the application and see what happens. So in order to boot up the application, just go here. Actually, we need to run this Java file. So let's actually run this Spring Boot app and see what happens. Hopefully we should not have any errors. Let's see. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I don't see any error. So let's go to the Mozilla browser for testing and access the localhost colon 8080 and see what happens. Yeah, looks like it works fine because the moment I access that URL, it automatically redirected me to the Cognito user pool screen, login screen, which means it is working fine. So the configuration everything looks good. Since the user has not logged in, it Spring Boot web application already knows that the user don't have a session, so it redirects to the Spring Boot to the Cognito identity pool, sorry, Cognito user pool login page. So now let's go back to the Cognito user pool and create a test user for testing this integration. So let me actually create a user called test user 1, and I will set a password. So the user is created. Let's again go to the screen and add some additional user attributes like some dummy email address, and I'm going to add a given name, and then I'm going to add a name, and I'm going to add a family name and save the changes. So now I have the user created, test user created. So let's go back to the screen again and again try to access the Spring Boot app. And now let's actually log in. Okay, the saved password is not working. First time it asks me to reset the password, so I'm going to reset it. Yes, so the login worked. The login worked. That's why you are seeing this message called demo from the Spring Boot web app. So now if I again try to access the same Spring Boot web apps URL, it will directly show this page called demo. That is because I already have a session. Now I will clear all the cookies. So this is a very handy plugin that is available in the Mozilla browser. You can use any plugin for clearing the cookies, but I use this plugin. So I will clear all the cookies. So there are no cookies in this particular browser instance. Now if I try to access again, it will redirect me to the Cognito user pools login page. And again, if I sign in, it successfully authenticates the user and redirects back to the Spring Boot web app application, which shows this demo page. Now let's actually enhance this page. Again, if you go back to this blog, it explains what I showed here. Whatever I explained here, it shows all those details here, but I will show one more thing. So I'm going to use this SAML tracer, which is again another very good plugin that is used widely. I'm going to use that plugin. Somehow it's not working for me. I don't know what happened. So let me actually open the developer tools. So let's open the developer tools, go to the network tab, and all the cookies are cleared. So I will again access localhost 8080. So if you look at the network tab, when I try to access localhost 8080, it redirected to the Cognito hosted UI, the OAuth 2 authorized endpoint with a response type equal to code, the client ID, all these details. And then Cognito hosted UI showed the login page. Now when I log in, the Cognito hosted UI redirected back to the Spring Boot web app localhost colon 8080 with the authorization code, and then in the backend Spring Boot web app actually called the token endpoint to get the tokens and display this page. So you can see this diagram. You can again see this diagram to understand this end-to-end flow where Spring Boot web app redirects to OAuth to authorize endpoint, and then after the user is authenticated, Cognito user pool posts returns an authorization code back to the Spring Boot web app in the URL parameter, and Spring Boot web app makes a token endpoint call with that authorization code to get the tokens validated and show the home page. So that's what is happening here, and that's what you can see it here in the developer tools. Now let's slightly enhance this application by adding a welcome page. Again, go back to this blog, and we need to add certain elements in the index.html page which we already created. So you can read through all these steps at a later point of time, but as of now just copy it, go back to this IDE. Let me stop the application, and we need to add this div within the body element. Add it here, again format it so that it is easier for readability, and then copy this script element and add it here, again format it, and then we need to add a user endpoint in the Spring application. So you can see the instructions here, and in this case it says social application.java, but in my case by default it created a Java file called Cognito ASB demo application.java. So I'm going to use that same Java file, and we need to add this REST controller annotation, add it here, and make sure it is imported. It says, yeah, so it got imported, and I need to add a method called slash user. So add it here, and we need to import all these things. So import it and import this one, and we need to create a web security configurer adapter. So here, this is where I told there are some outdated details in this documentation which we need to modify. So go back to this documentation and scroll down a bit, and then you will see what needs to be done here. So basically some things have changed. So this web security configurer adapter is not available in the latest framework. So we need to build a new Java class, create a new Java class which has the security filter chain bean. So let's create this one, this new Java class, finish, and let's add these two annotations and make sure it is imported, and copy this bean, and this with defaults will actually throw an error. So now, like I was not sure what was happening, and then I went to Stack Overflow and searched with defaults not found. Spring Boot not found. So the very first link that I got actually gave the solution. And if I scroll down, it says I need to import this static package. So basically copy that and put it here. Then that error will go away. I didn't find this instruction here, but I found it there. So I just added it here. Now, if you check this blog again, it says it permits all for some of these and matches, basically URLs. So let's actually go here and check if everything is fine. So yeah, I think everything looks good. Let's actually rerun this Spring Boot app and see what happens. And here I will clear all the cookies and again try to access and log in again. Yes, so now you can see some additional details here which says logged in as test user 1, and that is because we added all these additional HTML logic here, like logged in as the user details. Actually what happens is once I logged in, when it displays this index.html, it makes a call to this slash user endpoint to get the user details from the ID token that is generated by Cognito identity provider. So you go here the principal.get attribute of name. So the name of this user is actually test user 1. So you can see it here. This user's name is test user 1, and that is what you are seeing here. So let's do something like instead of name, I will get the email and let's see what happens. And I will go here. I will again clear the cookies so that we can start the login from the beginning. And let's log in. Now you can see the user's email address, which is testuser1@example.com, right? So So basically you can get all the attributes here. This one is a very basic example where it gets only the name, single attribute. So basically you can change this logic into a map and add all the attributes like name, given name, last name, email, and then return the map back to index.html where you can display the entire user details. So the idea here is like whatever I explained in the beginning, right? So what we did in this entire video is basically create a Cognito user pool, build a Spring Boot web app from scratch, and integrate the Spring Boot web app with the Cognito identity provider, which is basically the Cognito user pool using the OpenID Connect protocol and authorization code Grandflow. And as I said in the beginning, the Spring Boot web app takes care of many of these steps, like for example, the step 7 or 8 or step 2 where it redirects to Cognito user pool, and also step 9 where it validates the tokens. All these things are already built into the Spring Boot framework, the security framework. And you can always, as I said, you can always customize. So you can go through this documentation where it talks about how to customize each of these steps. Like you can even do this entire end-to-end configuration without Spring Boot. That's what they explain here. So you can customize it, but in 90% of the use case, or I would say even 95% of the use cases, you don't have to customize, or you will not have the necessity to customize. You should be able to use many of these steps as it is, like whatever is available in the framework. And once the user logs into your web application, you will already have all the details in the Spring Boot framework. For example, this OAuth to user object will have all the user details. So let me actually do one thing. So I will actually debug so that you can see what is available in this OAuth to user object. So I will again clear the cookies and I will log in again. Yeah. So now I have a debug point there. So that's why it stopped. So let's see what is available in this OAuth to user object. So let's actually switch to the debug perspective. And somewhere it should show all the variables. Let me check. Yeah. So when I watch this variable, so you can see this is that OAuth to user object, and you can see the list of attributes. So here you can see all the user attributes, the subject of the user, the sub value of the user, the email verified, what is the name of the user, it's test user one, the given name is test, family name is user one, email is test user one at example.com, and username is test user one. And this subject you can copy and verify the same in the Cognito user console. Just Control F and find it. So this is the user's subject value which you are seeing here. And you can see all the other attributes like name, email, family name, given name. So all these user attributes are available in the OAuth to user object. Uh, and so what you need to do in your web application when you're using Spring Boot framework is it's very simple. Just integrate with your OpenID Connect identity provider. It can be Cognito or Okta or Auth0 or AzureID, anything, and then build your business logic. And whenever you need the user details in any of the web pages, you just use this OAuth to user object and you will get it. Excuse me. So I hope you like this video. I'm sure you will have lots of questions. So please post your questions or comments in the YouTube comments. And thanks for watching this video. And please don't, sorry about that. Please don't forget to subscribe.